Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. For this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild adventure, The Sunken Village of Little Corth, designed by Dylan Hyatt for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider supporting me using my affiliate links or via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shout out to Platinum patrons, Andrew, Brian, Richard, and Joe. And Gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy and Yuma, Marcos, David, Vicente, Gilberto, Sean, aka Cert2B, Adam, and Dead Lizard Lounge. Thank you all very much for your support. Sunken Village of Little Corth is a time-traveling adventure, which is not something I really see much in tabletop RPGs, or at least when with D&D is concerned. Obviously, there's a lot of time travel stories out there, but I don't think specifically I've reviewed or read any in D&D. And it's a neat idea. I think there's some potential there. Obviously, with time travel, you have the problem of it never really making much sense if you think about it, so you always have to kind of suspend some bit of logic there. And it usually creates some very, paradoxes or inconsistencies, and this can lead to even more problems with role-playing because you've got other players there to muck up your plans. And part of the problem with this adventure, which I think would be the case for a lot of time travel stories, is that it really requires the players to make certain choices and really play along pretty closely with the DM. It's very linear. It's very railroady. If that's okay with your group, if your players are okay with kind of playing along very, very closely to what the DM is concocting, then I think it could work pretty well. On the other hand, if you have players that really want to explore and do their own things and kind of have fun with it, in their own way. It's not to say you can't enjoy being railroaded and just following a very linear story. There's obviously very much enjoyment in there. I mean, it's not to go on a rant, but it's the debate between like an open world game and like a JRPG style RPG. Like those are, those can both be Skyrim is an RPG and a Final Fantasy game is an RPG, but one of them is going to be much more about the storytelling and the other one is going to be more about you exploring and doing your own thing. And there's room for both of those. RPGs, you want to try to hit the middle of that thread, I think, as much as you can for the best success. And this one is way more on one extreme end of the scale. There's very, very little in the way of exploration, and even in the way of player agency. It's almost just like the DM has just dropped all these things down in front of you, and you're just supposed to follow all of these things pretty much exactly. It is a level 2 adventure, which is kind of surprising, given that it is also 40 pages long. It's very, very lengthy. It's very dense. There's a lot going on. And for level 2, usually you can't do much at that level. I like that it's not level 1 because we all know level 1 is bullshit. Tier 1 in general can be hard to write stuff for, although that's probably where the majority of the DM's Guild is looking for content. Level 2, I mean, you're basically fighting a bunch of cultists and skeletons and zombies, and unfortunately there's a lot of combat encounters, and I don't think any of them are super particularly interesting, but there are some exceptions to that. So let's dive in to the Sunken Village of Little Corth. My initial reaction is that I have reservations about it. I like a lot of the story ideas that are here, but it does require, again, that group to be very on board with extremely linear storytelling. So it's divided up into 3 parts, and it's got a pretty good summation of what all is going on. There's a lot of really rich background lore that's created with, from what I can tell, is just realm agnostic. I don't know if it's the author's own homebrew realm or what's going on here, but there's a lot of nice, you can see the adventure backstory here. Pretty much the first page and a half does a really good job of explaining to DMs, like, okay, what is this adventure about and what are the heroes supposed to do in every single part. That's very, very handy. Immediately what you can notice, however, is the actual physical writing here. Like, the way it's physically organized is kind of a nightmare. Like, these are giant walls of texts, and the font doesn't do it any favors. It's like a very basic, I don't know if this is Times New Roman, it looks like it. It doesn't look good in general, and then you've also got these just giant walls of texts that need a lot more paragraph breaks. Holy crap. That's not easy to read or digest at all. And you've already got a pretty densely packed adventure, and time traveling stories already have a lot going on. So to then create the physical organization of this adventure and make it kind of difficult to read is really exacerbating the issue here. So I'm not a fan of that at all. The actual I would say the actual writing is good. There's like zero errors. It's written well. It's just that the literal physical construction, I don't like the font, and it needs way more paragraph breaks, and it's just too wordy. I'm a writer. I get it. One of the big things I have to do whenever I write a rough draft is then like eliminate like at least a fourth of the text. Like I overly write. That's who I am. That's what I do. That's a big fault of mine. And I think this author might suffer from the same thing because it is extremely wordy. There's a puzzle later on that's literally like 4 pages long for one goddamn puzzle. And it's way overcomplicated. There's way too much going on. It's over-designed, and I dare say it might be overly written, although I do appreciate the backstory and everything that's here. It is a good summation of everything that's going on. So part 1, the players are just traveling to this village in this kind of swampy land I don't know, they're going somewhere else, Candolin, and they actually make it to Patham, this other town, and they find there's some weird encounters with some undead. I do like that there are almost all of the enemies here, or at least a lot of them, are actually custom-made enemies with some little fun bits. There's like zombies or a skeleton circus at one point with like jugglers that have like a little ability there, and there's a zombie sheepdog and a shepherd. Those are kind of fun things. So it's not literally just skeletons all the time, but you are basically fighting undead pretty much all the time. And it even mentions that clerics are super useful, although everybody here is immune to turn undead until you gain an artifact that fixes that. So you definitely want a cleric with you, and then there's an item that actually is going to work with that cleric that will make their ability essentially come back to them, which is also a weird caveat. It's like, oh, there's a bunch of undead, but oh, they're immune to turn undead unless you get my special artifact. Okay. Once they get to the town, though, there's a really fun adventure plot hook in that they see statues of themselves as venerated heroes from 2,000 years ago. They saved the town of Little Corth from an undead threat, from some horrible curse, but they actually died in the process. And then the village rises up every so often because it's still unfinished, I suppose. It's a really, really fun way to start an adventure. Is the adventures the heroes just see themselves as what the fuck, they're supposed to be the exactly party composition makeup are depicted as these statues that are like thousands of years old. And then the weird thing is, here's where the problems start arising. The heroes are supposedly buried in the graveyard here in the town. And if they go to exhume those graves, as most players would, because they're extremely curious about what the fuck is going on here, they see what are all the possibilities that can be made in this adventure, which is the PCs are not in there, or the PCs are in there but sleeping because they drank a special Deus Ex Machina potion that saved them from the adventure, or the PCs are dead in there. And it's written that they somehow see like all three of these things happening because of the temporal flux. And here's again the problem, is that it wants to do this clever storytelling conceit, which is fun, but it also knows that the players ultimately have the choice. So how do you do that? And here it just says, well, you see all three of them like together. You see all these different things that can happen. So, okay, you've got a time travel plot that's supposed to affect things in the present, but you already know that the players are going to be able to change things based on their choices. So there's just a weird kind of disconnect there with wanting to do the time travel plot, but then having the issue of some player choice. At least at the very end of the adventure, they're given the choices where they literally just drink this like Deus Ex Machina potion, which puts them in a sleep-like death, death-like sleep, quoting Sleeping Beauty, I believe, that lets them escape from the adventure. But it's a little bizarre. And then in part 2, they set off to go to Little Corth, on a road that literally railroads them. And by literally railroads, I mean it puts them in a single file road in a marsh that they're not supposed to deviate from. So they are literally a player character train going through and experiencing all of these encounters that then happen to them. I really laughed when I realized that it was literally like a single file little PC train moving through this DM gauntlet of horrors. And they have all these little encounters. They get these magic items, which have some cool notes on them. Some of them like have the name of one of the PCs like written on the box, and the PC's like, "What the fuck's going on?" And these are supposed to be like really good, which they're okay items, but for level 2, like any magic item is pretty good. They can even get a magic sword. They get a scroll that lets them open. It almost feels like an adventure game puzzle at this point. They get like a scroll of knock, and of course they then immediately find like a door that's sealed that requires knock. It's fine, okay. A silver arrow that points their way, grants +1 hit to damage if you use a ranged bow attack. Any class can attune to it. They get magical holy water, and this is when it starts getting interesting. They're attacked by a bunch of specters, which is actually the final boss trying to prevent the heroes from going back in time. So he has time traveled. He's got the actual time travel device, the time twister. And in doing so, when he attacks, the players actually see ghostly versions of themselves attacking half the squad, which is their party from the past. And then as the past, of course, you go back in time and you're going to see this event from the other angle, which is really cool. And then in this battle, the players are drawn into the past. And that begins that ends part 2, because part 2 is that whole little just gauntlet through the swamp. And then part 3 is them in the past in Little Corth. You can see here the map. None of these are actual, like, really usable gridded battle maps. Actually, I think one of them, the Manor House, you could technically use, but it's still, like, annotated on there. So we don't really get any battle maps, although I do like this sketch right here, this kind of isometric looking map. I think that's really nice looking. You can see the little cultists with the little triangle hoods and all that. That all looks really nice. I would have preferred to have, in addition to this, some kind of a battle map for at least the major encounters. Would have been nice to have, not necessarily maybe for all the random encounters in the swamp. And the players can explore around the village of Corth, finally. So you get to part 3, the last third of the adventure, and now you finally open it up just a little bit for the PCs to be able to explore the village on their own. Before then, it was 100% railroaded, and the PCs had to do things boom, 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 boom. Now they're given a little bit of choice, but even then, it's just the barest of exploration. They can explore the manor house, which is kind of a dungeon, but really it's just one big room full of like cultists and zombies. There is Rose's cottage, which is, they can't do anything there, but they just see the fact that she's brewing these elixirs. So it's not maybe quite a Deus Ex Machina, but she's like, I'm making the elixirs that are going to save you all at the end of this adventure. The only thing that's really going on is at Cornelius's house. There's an old man with a big device which can help the players kind of thwart the time twister bubble that is currently the ritual that is, what is his name, Vodrin, I think? Vorden, the high priest. This is before he becomes a undead, so they meet him in his spectral form because he's moving through to thwart the heroes. They meet him in his second attempt first. Are you confused yet? And then they meet him at the first attempt here. But at Cornelius' house, they have to solve this extremely complicated, ridiculous puzzle. You can see here is the artist's rendition of how this puzzle works. This makes a Myst puzzle look like child's play. Like, this is insane. It is, I think, literally 4 pages long. You can see just walls and walls of text. I'm just going to read you a part of this. The chamber's round ceiling, 40 feet high, is painted deep blue and decorated with sparkling silver studs arranged in the zodiacal constellations. That's great. The Ori floor, apart from its 5-foot wide stone circumference, is the top side of the huge bronze disc, 85 feet diameter, comprising the ceiling of the chamber below. Running west to east ahead of you in a line, the 7 steel rods of the mechanism downstairs emerge, each poking 3 foot high through the Ori floor and supporting a luminous 1-foot crystal orb. The chamber has no windows, but is lit by the Ori orbs, which glow in the particular colors the celestial bodies represent. The central orb is yellow and glows the brightest, representing the sun. On your right, the stair continues upward spiral 180 degrees around the wall of the opposite east side, where a trapdoor in the ceiling acts as a flat observatory. This is like an SAT question. It's bonkers. It's too much. I appreciate a good puzzle design, and I appreciate that there is an attempt to make a good, memorable puzzle here. But what it really comes down to is the device turns on, and all the orbs start spinning, and it's a bunch of like skill checks to try to avoid them. Now the party and then save somebody, the inventor's daughter, I guess, who gets trapped in there, immediately damseled. And there is a little bit of a system for figuring out where they're all supposed to go. This is way overly written. Like, this should have been a page. If you have to start writing, look at these just giant blocks of text here too. Also, just please give me a paragraph. Please just give me multiple paragraphs in here. It's way overcomplicated. There's way too much going on in this puzzle. I like that there was a puzzle here that's just a pure, nice, like, adventure game style puzzle, and it's D&D-ified because there's like some skill checks. There's even a rule for if your players are running this on a grid mat, you can try to move around and figure where things are, and that seems absolutely crazy. It's just way too much. I'm not going to knock the adventure for doing it this way, but this is way overly written and way overly complicated of a puzzle to take up like 4 damn pages. The players are meant to be doing all these events, meeting all these people, and they're supposed to be finding all of their magic items. So when they transported into the past all of those items that they had gained in Part 2, the Gauntlet of the Swamp Run, where it was just, here's an encounter, here's an item, all disappeared. And the idea here is that the players gain these items and meet all these people in the past, and then all these things start to make sense. And as they gain these items, they're meant to, at some point, take these items and place them in the place where they found them in the future/present, as now they are in the past, so that they are there for the players to find them in the future/present. The problem is that's completely up to the players. For things to make sense, they do this. But if they don't have to, it's the player's choice. And if they want to hang on to the items, that's fine. That makes the first part of the adventure not make as much sense because those items aren't there. That it really breaks down. And also, the final battle is either easier or more difficult depending on how many of those items the players acquired, and if they returned them to their places that they should be for the adventure to make sense. In fact, it might turn the final battle nigh impossible because it brings in a whole lot of new reinforcement. So, again, the adventure works if everybody is willing to make it work. And I think that's a bummer when an adventure really forces players into making certain choices. It just feels too much like you want to give those players enough agency to really mold part of the story themselves. So a lot of this, for example, and part of the fun is seeing, okay, well, here's where these things came from. But when you get like some of these inscriptions that have like the player's name on them, they have certain things written on them. And then the idea is like the amulet has the lid which says, "Thanks Sir Darcy, Knight of Holen." And the idea is the players are supposed to then tell the person in the past, okay, write this certain inscription. Well, wouldn't that be more fun if the players actually wrote their inscription, their own inscription, and then that became the inscription in the present? But then you have to like, okay, well, is this, which time travel rules are we using? Does that mean that inscription is going to change then in the future? Or did we need to start the adventure and then not show that item until after it's affected because it was always there? How does that work? Well, I don't know what the solution there is, but again, it's weird that these inscriptions are already provided and the players are supposed to play along with the exact story the DM has written. I think that's a fallacy a lot of DMs and storytellers fall into, is that you want to tell a very certain story and you're writing it as if your players are doing those exact things. And I don't think you can ever assume that your players are going to be doing those exact things. And, it might make a great story, and maybe your players are going to want to play along with that, and that's fine. But I think you need to be prepared for if your players don't want to play along with that, or maybe they think they're coming up with a better story, you need to roll with that. And it becomes problematic because a lot of this adventure requires them to make certain choices. So, you can see here the Manor Grounds is just a very, very minor combat encounter with a bunch of cultists and zombies, a little bit of treasure they can get. There is a funny remark somewhere, I think it was actually at the inn, where they can find a nice bottle of whiskey, and it realizes that if they manage to You can see in one playtest, the fighter of the party arranged for the whiskey barrel to be taken by the Exodus and stored at the apple cart in Pantham for 2,160 years to the party's return. And a barrel of 2,000-year-old whiskey could be worth up to 5,000 gold. That's a funny mention that the author didn't even... An example where the designer didn't realize, oh yeah, they could take something from the past and it would be worth like super amount of money in the present, which would be that's a pretty funny example. And I'm glad that's just kind of mentioned in there as a neat idea. By the way, the main villain's motivation is completely superfluous to the actual main plot of this adventure. His motivation, he's already got the time twister, and he's in the middle of his goal, which is to thwart some ancient battle and defeat some ancient elven lord. None of that fucking matters. The players just end up thwarting his plans, and then from that point on, the villain is basically just trying to defeat the players. Now he does try again. I guess he does have a third ritual attempt. So his second attempt, which the players have to then go and thwart in the past, is him turning into a specter and going into the future present to try to stop the players, which, you know, it gets real confusing there. But it's neat because the players can then see that battle from their point of view. I do like that event. That's a really memorable part. And then the third time twister is basically just a redo of the first one as he tries to then complete his initial ritual. So the main plot is basically just, again, the DM setting up these rituals and the players reacting to them. Hopefully they are doing interesting things in between those plots and they're visiting all these locations and the DM can kind of place them in organically, so it's not just the players are literally waiting around for Vorden to make his next move. The final battle changes... Let's see if I can get down to it. Here we go. The Temporal Discontinuity Checklist. So for every single item the party didn't find and return to the place it's supposed to be, which is where they find it in the future, bad things happen. So that could be that additional undead appear. That can be that they just don't gain the items of the magical elf sword and healing berries, which are a bunch of like healing potions, or their entire party like sinks into mud. That's kind of a weird one. Or the spectral cultists that were defeated by the holy water appear. So a lot of the things that we're supposed to like prevent all these various bad things from happening to them in the future then happen to them during this final climactic battle. And the adventure does mention the fact that let's see, this could be quite a deadly encounter, especially if the PCs haven't seeded the marsh path with the magical items, which proves so helpful in their journey back in their future past. It doesn't look too bad on paper, but it's hard to tell just because there are a lot of extra enemies being added to this fight. I believe Vorden is given his own, Cult Fanatic Ghoul Vorden is given his own stat block. I do like all of the custom monsters. At level 2, you don't usually see, at Tier 1 in general, you don't see a whole lot of custom monsters being used. And here they're nicely being given just like the baseline, skeletons and zombies, and then they're given slightly tweaked abilities, which I do appreciate that. And there's a failure state too. Of course, if they fail, the players die, and the necromancers take over the world. The undead cult of one of his Orkanu. If they succeed, then the players can choose because the bad guy curses them to where they have to die. And if they try to leave the area, they're dead. But the old woman Rose appears, gives them elixirs of deathly slumber, and then they wake up in the coffins. They wake up buried. So again, assuming they played everything correctly, they won, they take the elixirs, then they go into a sleep, but the elixirs kind of backfire in some weird way to where they sleep for then 2,000 some years. Perfectly okay, of course. Very much like the death-like slumber. And they wake up and the townsfolk exhume the bodies, which is the heroes, and they wake up in coffins 2,000 years later. If everything plays out, I think that works really well. But again, you require very, very specific linear storytelling, and you need the players to make very specific choices in order for it to work. So, if everything works, I think this is a really good adventure. It's got a lot of fun time-traveling shenanigans. It uses the time-traveling conceit in some fun ways. There's nice custom enemies. It's not too... It's still a very constrained location. There's a little bit of choice for the players to make and go around and do. But on the other hand, it is extremely linear, Literally, part 2 is a literal railroad as you go through and have to do very certain things. And everything needs to happen in order for the adventure to work out well. And also, the actual physical construction of it is a bit of a nightmare. Like, there's huge walls of text and very plain font, which just looks distracting compared to a lot of DM's Guild stuff, which uses, again, you don't have to use scaly sands, but something else other than like Times New Roman. It just does not look great for every single line of text in here. So ultimately, I have mixed feelings about it. I think it's a neat idea. I think it needed another pass of editing, not for grammatical errors. I think it is well written as is, but just for physical construction, it's just too damn wordy everywhere, and it needed more paragraph breaks and something to make it easier to read. And I think being given the chance to allow the players to change things up a bit would have gone a long way. But on the other hand, I don't know how you do that and still maintain that core time travel plot. That is a very, very hard line to walk, which is probably why you don't see a whole lot of time travel stuff in D&D. Let's go over my pros and cons for the Sunken Village of Little Corth. Pro: if all goes according to plan, the time travel plot and mysteries create a neat story tying together events and choices from the past and present. If it works well, if everybody's willing to play along, then I think it will work well. Pro: it is a very compelling plot hook and start to the adventure. Bungling into a town and finding this statues depicting of yourself, and the townsfolk mentioning that the heroes are buried out back from, centuries ago, millennia ago, really, is a really neat hook. I think that's a really fun start to the adventure. Cons: it is extremely linear and requires the PCs to make certain choices for the story to play out correctly. Con: it's got a really just plain font style and those huge walls of text that make the adventure way more difficult to read. And this is already a very densely packed adventure with a lot of shit going on, and time travel stories are already confusing enough. You've got to make it an easier read and probably eliminate like at least a fourth of the words here. Just figure out a way to streamline that shit. And then con, as always for me, no usable battle maps. I know not everybody uses maps. Shout out to all you Theater of the Mind folks. More power to you. I use maps. My group uses battle maps. At least like 1 or 2 maps that we can actually, player maps that we can use would have gone a long way for the adventure. Final verdict: it's excessively linear and a borderline chore to decipher, but the Sunken Village of Little Corth showcases lots of memorable story moments in a unique time-traveling tale. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. And you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.